Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about the latest, very significant repression of LGBT rights in Russia in the context of regime transformation, in the context of a regime that is transforming itself and transforming Russian society onto a holding pattern where it can sustain a long-term war that eventually might even be one that they hope escalates beyond Ukraine against the West. So what happened is that the Russian Supreme Court banned a fictional entity, the global LGBT movement, categorized it as an extremist organization. Now, if you're an extremist organization in Russia, that can get you up to 12 years. If you distribute any of the symbols of anything that's categorized as an extremist organization, that could get you very short term in jail to begin with, and up to 4 years later. Could also have your bank accounts frozen, put you on a list of extremists. That really means you can't work, you can't do basic financial transactions, and so on. And we'll talk about the political implications of that. We'll talk about how it's applied. And I've jotted down a couple of points I want us to not forget to raise along the way. Now, the history here is that predictably there's a lot of repression against LGBT folks at the end of the Tsarist period, as there indeed is everywhere. At the level of legal formality, that abates a bit at the beginning of the communist period, and then comes back an extraordinary crisis of violent repression under Stalin. Then there is a tapering off toward the end of the Soviet period, and a tapering off at the beginning of the 90s. And then a few years into the Putin period, there is a intensification of repression step by step, and perhaps we can go back to 10 years before today when they introduced that so-called gay propaganda law that you probably all heard about, because Russia was in the news about that in summer 2013. So what's this mean as far as Ukraine goes? Well, as far as Ukraine goes, what we're witnessing is that Ukraine's invader is transforming its regime and its society, right, so that it is fit for a long-term war footing. We talked about other respects in which this is happening, economic transformation too, militarization of the economy, but that's the broadest pattern in which to see this. This regime is going to continuously take steps to transform into the kind of vehicle it wants to do the kind of thing it hopes to do, which is engage in war. And war is partly about a kind of revolutionary goal of global transformation, but just as much, if not more than that, it is about a conservative goal of regime consolidation. There's, of course, an inherent paradox there, that they think that to conserve the regime, they need to engage in war, because war is an ultimately unpredictable activity. But that's the broad picture. Now, one of the things that this escalating attack on LGBT folks in Russia raises is this business of the conflict on the ex-Soviet space. That's a broader conflict than just the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That's to say, it's that old conflict we've talked about between something like an aspiration for the modern democratic republic that Ukraine's expressing, a lot of Belarus's population is expressing, that a small but vehement subsection of the Russian population is expressing, a conflict between that and authoritarian imperialism. And the reason the LGBT folks really draw our attention to that conflict is that it's possible to say that the Putin regime has been at war with you if you're gay, at war with you if you're trans, increasingly at war. And this raises interesting questions of legitimacy too, because the paradigm of an illegitimate regime is a regime that's at war with its own population. And there are many respects in which the Putin regime is at war with segments of its population. And then this could be a more controversial argument about whether there might not be a way in which it's at war with the majority of its population too. So thinking of gay and trans folks in Russia in particular helps us think of this question of legitimacy, of this question of regimes being at war with their own people, and helps us think of this conflict between something more akin to a modern democratic republic and something more akin to return to the 19th century. We say that without teleological implications. We reject teleology here. Well, you might not. I do. So you don't have to, but I have to tell you that I do. Why are they doing this now? So I've made a note here which says that the circle of internal enemies, this is another one of those very, very small p predictions that I'm putting on the table. The circle of internal enemies will widen in Russia over the months and years to come, in a way that neither the victims nor the perpetrators will be able to entirely predict. Now, LGBT folks are, of course, an easy target. It's not going to be blowback. And there is also a sort of sense in which you can make them out to be a kind of enemy that is all around us. It is everywhere yet nowhere. You can't exactly see it, but yet it's here, blah, blah, blah. So there is something sort of sick and insidious that they can do by pushing this. Now, where are the Russian people here? And I think there are two features that are worth putting on the table. One is that the level of intolerance and prejudice in Russia is organically high, but there is a way in which it's also reasonable to qualify that and say, well, it's not that high, which means that certainly as a political issue, LGBT rights are organically less important to Russians than they are to Americans, actually, or than they are to Poles. It is harder to mobilize Russians, actually, politically, to go against gay people, to go against trans people, than it is to mobilize US folks, actually. Now, hard, but possible, right? Just think what happens when you have total control of the media, when you have a lack of a change of government, when the education system is being muzzled, when the courts are muzzled. But what I'm saying is that if you got rid of all of that crap tomorrow, would the Russians be more prejudiced than Brits? Yeah, they would. By quite a bit. But at the same time, nowhere near as much as you'd think. And the issue would not be anywhere near as much of a political priority as it might seem from all the regime propaganda. So there are some regime messages that are very effective because there's a top-down story that attaches itself to a bottom-up story. Here, the top-down story dominates. And if you want a bit more on this sort of stuff, Jeremy Morris has written about this and has written academic papers about this. Persecution of LGBT folks in Russia and public opinion about that. But I need to add a negative qualifier here. So what should it be? Let me say this. I do think one feature of prejudice and discrimination in Russia is that there's an extraordinary capacity of tolerance for intolerance. That's to say that if you put a Russian who isn't terribly exercised, doesn't really understand the experience of gay people, doesn't understand the experience of trans people, but doesn't care either way, and doesn't have overtly discriminatory beliefs, right? But you put that kind of Russian next to somebody who is sort of murderous about it in their views, a la middle of the 20th century, then the tolerant Russian will tolerate the intolerant Russian. The tolerant Russian might say, well, whatever, each to their own. The intolerant Russian might say, well, let's have them all be moved here and let's have that done to them. But the tolerant Russian might say, well, interesting. I mean, I don't see it that way. Whereas in the West, somebody who is conscious of gay and trans rights, somebody who is, heterosexual and tolerant, would be rather taken aback by that. In Russia, they wouldn't be on the whole. So that's one important feature about Russian society. Now, I mean, this makes the level of fear, if you're gay or in Russia, very great, especially if you want to do anything outward about being gay, communicate about it on social media, for example. And as much as it's worth being anxious about various vigilante activity, the main fear you have is really the fear of the state, the fear of something, an axe being put through your door at 6 a.m. and your place being searched and charges being thrown at you. How will this be applied? So we know that the point of authoritarian regimes, such as the Putin regime, insofar as it is still an authoritarian regime, is to pick up a minority of the people it wants to target as a way of scaring the rest. That's what authoritarian regimes, crudely speaking, do. Totalitarian regimes go about trying to pick up everybody, right? So the application of this, obviously, is devastatingly asphyxiating, really, of any LGBT identity expression in public. But whether this is a story of picking on some to scare others or picking on everyone depends on that conversation we've always had about how totalitarian Russia goes, how much politicization will happen in society, how much the regime will preserve or be stuck with a depoliticized population as opposed to some process of fascization or politicization taking place. In the family dynamic, of course, this creates an even deeper conflict between love and fear, right? If you've got a gay child, and fear is going to win more. And so, getting to the heart of the why, we are talking about this Gherkinization of Putin ahead of the election in 2024, that appealing stuff needs to be thrown to various kinds of radicals who are unhappy about the moderate nature of Putin's domestic politics, in quote marks, and the moderate nature, in quote marks, of his, in fact, brutal invasion of Ukraine, and the unsuccessful nature of it too. Where's our victory? We don't just want a war. And where is the conversion of society that is rapid and total onto a war footing? So these folks need to be thrown some stuff, and one of the easiest things to throw at them is to make the lives of LGBT folks more disastrous. One point that's very important here is, and I won't elaborate on it much, that the conservatism of the Putin regime is entirely fake. These are not real conservatives. These are conservatives, these are fake conservatives who play conservatism as political technology. And that's one of those things that Jordan Peterson has fallen for. If you look at some of his earlier content that he made about Russia, he got fooled by this. Which is, of course, an expression, right, of something we know very much about, which is the exploitation of foreign policy issues, whether it be Russia, Ukraine, or Gaza, Israel, Hamas, for the benefit of scoring points in domestic culture wars. An important question is, wait a minute here. What about all those gay people in the Putin regime? There's a lot of them. And people who know the regime well know who they are, in fact. So what could possibly be happening? Are these people not thinking about the future? And I think there are two kind of answers here. As well as people who are in their private life quarter or semi-open about their homosexuality, folks in power. On top of these people, there are also people who are not open at all and not even open with themselves, even though it's quite obvious. And so, obviously, incapacity to bear oneself is, I think, one psychological, we shouldn't overstate it because it's a bit of political technology, really, but it's really is a part of the top-down homophobia. So, not the central, but a causal factor in Russia's atrocious repressive policies against gay people is that these policies are done by gay people. So there's a bit of that. Gay people who are in denial about being gay. And then the people who have little enclaves and capsules in their life where they preserve their quasi-secret homosexual identity, they think that'll just carry on. And here their thought goes back to what we started with. That's to say, this distinction, we mentioned earlier, this distinction between a society that drifts in a more totalitarian direction, society that stops many places short of that. So they think that unless there's genuine political mobilization, it's going to be possible to do partly sweeping, partly pointillistic repressions against LGBT people while maintaining in one's own private lives little enclaves where one can engage in homosexual activity. So they think that as long as Russia is stuck between being an authoritarian and totalitarian regime without drifting too rapidly toward totalitarianism, this sort of utterly repulsive hypocrisy that's destroying people's lives, of course, will be sustainable, they hope, right? So that's all I've got for today. But the big picture here is we are looking at a regime that is continuously reformatting itself to be more fit for a purpose that it attributes to itself for the years to come, and that purpose is war. Lots of love. Talk soon.